Chapter 18, A Lamb Cries in the Night. "The last will and testament of George Glenn," said the lawyer, "drawn up and signed this 30th day of April, 1999, in the presence of three witnesses, one being a sworn lawyer, namely myself." The lawyer looked round. A pair of curious eyes gleamed behind his glasses. Not only were the villagers of Glenkill keen to know what would happen next, so was the lawyer. The atmosphere under the lime tree was like the air before a summer storm, ominous and expectant. The suspense was terrible. Silent, oppressive heat, a thunderstorm brewing in their heads. "To be publicly read on the Sunday following my death, or one Sunday later at 12 noon under the old village lime tree of Glenkill." The lawyer looked up at the canopy of leaves above him. One leaf had floated down and landed on his immaculately tailored shoulder. He plucked it off and turned it this way and that in front of his eyes. "Undoubtedly a lime tree," he said. "But is it the village lime?" Yes, yes," said Josh impatiently. "That's the village lime. You can get started." "No, I can't," said the lawyer. "You can't?" asked Lily. "You make us all come down here, and now you aren't going to read us the will?" "No," said the lawyer again. "What's the idea?" asked Eddie. The lawyer sighed. Suddenly, a watch glinted on his wrist, a very fine watch, like the one George had worn for working in his vegetable garden. "It's exactly 11:56. Believe me, I'm right." That was meant for those present who had looked at their own wrist watches. "I can't help you before 12. The humans began muttering. Annoyance, indignation, nervousness, and even a little relief crept into their insect-like voices. Led by Othello, the sheep ventured closer. They had set off all together when the time of short shadows began to see if the will and testament would reveal anything. The murderer, or at least an important clue. No one took any notice of them. Othello had drummed it into them that they must creep up to the humans as quietly and naturally as dogs. But even if they had galloped up to the lime tree bleating at the tops of their voices, hardly anyone would have noticed. The human beings were much too busy looking at their watches. The church clock struck 12. "Now," the people under the lime tree whispered, but the lawyer shook his head. "It's fast. You'll want to put it right next chance you get." Another angry mutter. Then the humans fell silent one by one. Yet again Mopple saw fear padding through their ranks, with its mane blowing in the wind, rubbing around the landlord Josh's legs like a cat, sending its cold breath down Eddie's back, grinning as it sniffed at Kate's black dress. Then a muted murmur rose from the humans again. Rebecca had joined them, her dress like a drop of blood against the morning black that most of them wore. All eyes followed her, one pair after another. Othello could see exactly what was going on. Rebecca was a feast, and the men were grazing. The lawyer let his watch disappear again under a white cuff. He cleared his throat to get the villagers' attention back. The sheep were all agog. This was the first time in ages that they'd had anything read aloud to them, and George himself had written the will. "To my wife, Kate, I leave my library, including 73 trashy novels, one detective story, a book of Irish fairy tales, and a book of the diseases of sheep, as well as everything else that the law considers her due. The lawyer looked up. You can keep the house, he said, and you'll get a small annuity, too. Kate nodded, gritting her teeth. To my daughter, Rebecca Flock, a whisper ran through the crowd. George? Daughter? A little something on the side? Adultery? I leave my landed property, consisting of pastures in Glenhill, Golash, and Tolly Kinnery. Othello looked at Rebecca in her bright red dress. She was like a poppy standing among the black and gray clad villagers. She had gone very pale, and her lips were compressed. No one was taking any notice of her. Kate sobbed. Ham looked at her with concern. So that's it, someone or other said. No, said the lawyer, that's not it. Mopple could positively see muscles tensing under the black clothes. Would it get out now? But if so, what was it? Mopple prepared for flight. To Beth Jameson, I leave my Bible. Bible-bashing Beth, sitting in the third row, began sobbing uncontrollably with her hand over her mouth. To Abraham Rackham, I leave my Smith & Wesson, with its silencer, being of the opinion that he will need it. Ham sat there in his wheelchair. His eyes were moist. He nodded grimly. I know what you are thinking now, said the lawyer. Not all of you, but enough. How can you know that? Lily asked him. I'm quoting, said the lawyer. The expression on the villagers' faces was blank. The lawyer sighed again. The sheep sympathized with him. Even they knew what quoting meant. Roughly, anyway. It was something like reading aloud. And I have considered it for a long time, the lawyer went on. But I won't do it. Just go on living your lousy little lives. The lawyer looked up. I expect you can make more of that than I do. Is that all? Asked Josh with perceptible relief in his voice. The lawyer shook his head, cleared his throat, and leafed through his papers. The rest of my fortune, amounting at the present time to the sum of, and here the lawyer mentioned a number that the sheep had never heard before, I leave to. The lawyer was taking his time. His clever eyes glittered through his glasses as he observed the people of Glenhill under half-closed lids. They had gone very quiet. In the middle of a silence, Kate burst into hysterical laughter. I leave to my sheep so that they can go to Europe as I had promised them. Kate went on laughing in silence, an ugly laugh that penetrated the sheep's fleeces like cold rain. Ham blinked hard, as if the same rain were falling on him too. Is that some kind of a joke? Asked Harry the sinner. No, said the lawyer. It's perfectly legal. I shall administer the money. Of course, the animals will also need an authorized representative to go with them to Europe as their shepherd. That representative's rights and duties are clearly set out in the will. So, who is it then? Asked Tom O'Malley in suspense. That, said the lawyer, hasn't been decided yet. I am to use my own judgment in appointing one, preferably now. Does anyone present happen to want the job? Silence. The lawyer nodded. Of course, you need to know what it would entail. I have prepared some details here, and he handed printed sheets out to the villagers. Lily giggled. The sheep are to have stories read aloud to them for at least half an hour a day. Who'd do a thing like that? The authorized representative, said the lawyer. All the conditions will, of course, be checked by a third party, namely me. None of the sheep may be sold. None of the sheep may be slaughtered. In breeding them, Odin's fleece is to be the prime concern? Asked Eddie. Not what you'd call economic. It doesn't have to be, said the lawyer. You'll see the representative's salary at the bottom of the page. Every time one of the sheep dies, it will be decreased by a certain amount, but it still appears to me a handsome figure. And when they're all dead, asked Gabriel, of an epidemic, for instance. In that case, there will be a small final premium in recognition of services rendered, and all further payments will lapse. Gabriel stepped forward. I'll do it, he said. Very good, said the lawyer. Any other offers? The people of Glenkill looked at each other nervously. They looked at their printed sheets and then back at Gabriel and the lawyer. Some of them seemed to be thinking feverishly. A strange light had come into their eyes, and suddenly there was a faint smell of sweat in the air. Expectant, hungry, but they looked at Gabriel, standing beside the lawyer with his hands in his trouser pockets, and they kept silent, like with a lead ram, thought the sheep. When the lead ram has taken something on, no other sheep would dream of disputing it with him. But then one sheep did dream. Are you sure there's no one else? Asked the lawyer. There was a touch of disappointment in his smooth tone. I'd like to do it, said a warm voice, a good voice for reading aloud in. Excellent, said the lawyer, looking at Rebecca almost with a touch of gratitude. Pale but beaming, she was standing next to Beth. The sheep were relieved. With Gabriel, they wouldn't even have wanted to go to Europe. And who's going to decide which of them it will be? Asked Lily. You? The heirs, of course, said the lawyer. The sheep? Asked Ham breathlessly. The sheep, the lawyer confirmed. Then we'll have to go up to the meadow, said Gabriel. His blue eyes were laughing at Rebecca. I don't think so, said the lawyer. It appears to me that the heirs are already among us, a black four-horned Hebridean ram, a mountain blackface, a merino, and the rest Clador with some black-faced crosses. The last Clador flock in all Ireland, an old Irish breed of sheep. It's a shame they're not raised anywhere else these days. The humans turned, first just in surprise, but then they looked down on George's flock with undisguised hostility. Gabriel examined the sheep with a critical frown on his brow. Sheep! Oh, sheep! Gasped Ham, who had been sitting in the front row in his wheelchair. Now that they had turned, he was suddenly in the back row. He couldn't see, and he had no idea what was going on. No one took any notice of him. The herd of humans and the flock of sheep faced each other. The humans' eyes ran over the sheep like lice running over their coats. The three rams had retreated slightly, but they had no intention of running away. Good, said the lawyer. Then we'll see. See what? Asked Lily with some derision in her voice. I'm not exactly sure myself, said the lawyer. Since my new clients can't talk, we'll have to try some other way. Would you, he said, turning to Rebecca, please stand here? And you, he said, turning to Gabriel, over there, please. Good. He turned to the sheep. George Glenn's sheep, said the lawyer, who was obviously enjoying himself. Who would you like to accompany you to Europe as your shepherd? Mr. He glanced at Gabriel. Gabriel O'Rourke, said Gabriel between gritted teeth. Or Ms. Rebecca Flock, said Rebecca. A murmur ran through the crowd. Even the lawyer raised his eyebrows. Kate began laughing hysterically again. Mr. Gabriel O'Rourke or Ms. Rebecca Flock, repeated the lawyer. The sheep's eyes moved silently back and forth between the lawyer and Rebecca. Rebecca, bleated Maud. Rebecca, bleated Lane, Cordelia, Mopple, and Chorus. But the lawyer didn't seem to understand them. The sheep, confused, fell silent. How could they let him know what they wanted? Nothing's going to come of this, someone said in an undertone. Give him to Gabriel. At least he knows how to get along with sheep. The villagers began to turn hostile towards Rebecca. She couldn't tell a sheep from a powder puff, someone murmured. Slapper, chirped a woman's voice. But a simple, captivating melody sang its way through the angry whispers. Gabriel had begun murmuring in Gaelic. Once it would have totally enchanted the sheep, and even now Gabriel's soft voice had an undeniable charm. Othello took a step forward while the flock kept close behind him. He looked briefly at Gabriel with glittering eyes. Then he calmly turned and trotted over to Rebecca. Gabriel cooed away in Gaelic like a demented pigeon, but it did him no good. One after another, the sheep clustered round Rebecca. Maud began bleating again. Rebecca, she bleated. Rebecca, bleated all the other sheep. Excellent, said the lawyer. I call that a unanimous vote. He closed his briefcase. George Glynn's sheep, he said, very politely. I hope you have a good time in Europe. Silently, as if in a dream, the sheep trotted back to their meadow. There was a lot they had not understood, but one thing they knew. Europe, a huge meadow full of apple trees, awaited them. We're going to Europe, said Zora in a daze. With the shepherd's caravan and Rebecca, added Cordelia. Cloud took a deep breath. She had been going to say wonderful or amazing or simply great, but all of a sudden she couldn't think of words anymore. She felt a little frightened. It's as if George had tipped out sugar beet and bread in front of us at the same time, said Mopple, with a wise look on his face. And apples, and pears, and concentrated feed. And calcium tablets, said Lane. Joy came over them slowly but intensely. At this very special moment, Zora retreated to her rocky lodge to meditate, while Heather leaped in the air. We're going to Europe, sang the lambs, and anyone grazing close enough to Richfield could hear him quietly humming along. But most of the sheep rejoiced in silence as they grazed, and only at second glance could you see the gleam in their eyes. Othello was the happiest of all. Now he would be able to put into practice all the things that George had taught him behind the shepherd's caravan in the evenings. How to lead a flock, how to keep your nerve while on the move, how to lead the others forcefully but cautiously past obstacles or over them. I've been waiting just for you, George had always told him when, yet again, he had done everything just right. With you, Europe will be child's play. And now they were going. Not with George, unfortunately, but Rebecca wasn't to be sneezed at either. Justice, pleaded Othello contentedly. Justice. Then he fell silent. Europe would be wonderful, but all the same. Suddenly, the black ram raised his head. It never got out, he snorted. The sheep stopped in the middle of their rejoicings and looked at Othello. He was right. This will had been full of splendid things, but they still didn't know who had murdered George. It doesn't matter, bleated Heather happily. We're going to Europe, and the murderer will have to stay here. He isn't dangerous anymore. It ought to get out, all the same, said Mopple bravely. Cordelia nodded. He read aloud to us. He made the will so that we could go to Europe. He ought really to have been coming with us. We mustn't take it lying down, said Zora. He was our shepherd. No one can just kill our shepherd like that and get away with it. We ought to find out before we go to Europe. Justice. The sheep proudly raised their heads. Justice, they bleated in chorus. Justice. Miss Maple stood in the midst of them, and her inquisitive eyes were sparkling. Towards evening, Rebecca came up from the village, George's daughter, their new shepherdess. She came on foot, carrying a small suitcase. Her face was paler than the whitewashed side of the shepherd's caravan. She put her suitcase down on the grass and climbed the steps to the caravan door. I'm going to live here now until we go to Europe, she explained to the sheep. I'm certainly not staying in that village any longer. She shook the door for a long time, tried levering the windows open, even fiddled around in the keyhole with a hairpin. Then she sat down on the top step of the caravan and put her head in her hands. George sometimes used to sit there just like that, motionless and solitary as an old tree. It seemed to the sheep almost uncanny. They realized Rebecca was sad. Melmoth began humming into the wind. Rebecca raised her head as if she had heard him and started whistling a tune. It fluttered through the air defiantly, reeling about like a butterfly on its first flight. She didn't notice the black figure that had appeared at the side of the meadow. The sheep twitched their ears nervously. Then the wind turned and told them it was only Beth coming into their meadow. Beth, looking for good works to do. She glided towards Rebecca, silent as a ghost. Rebecca sat there whistling and didn't even turn her head. I'm sorry, said Beth. Those heathens. Rebecca whistled. You won't have any luck with that door, said Beth. Eddie says it's a safety lock. You'll never open it. Rebecca was still whistling as if Beth wasn't there at all. Come back with me, said Beth. You can sleep at my place. I'm never going into that village again, said Rebecca in a calm voice. They said nothing for a while. Then Rebecca asked, Who is Wesley McCarthy? What? Beth came out of her thoughts with a start. Wesley McCarthy. I've been through the newspaper files, you see, of 7 years ago, when you were in Africa. Wesley McCarthy was found murdered in the stone quarry. An anonymous caller phoned the police to report it. No suspects, no arrest, nothing. It went out of the headlines at once. I think that's what you were looking for. Wesley McCarthy. Beth clutched the glittering pendant that hung round her neck. Weasel McCarthy, that's what they called him. Rebecca raised her eyebrows. There was a lot of talk at that time. No one knew where he came from or what he was doing in Glenkill, but he had money. He bought White Park and did it up. He lived there quietly for some time, so we thought. He was popular back then. Later, of course, everyone claimed to have had a funny feeling about him from the first. So then, well, it seemed all right to start with, said Beth. All the drinkers in the Mad Boar hung on his every word when he told them how he came by the money. Apparently, he began as a small farmer, and then, she laughed derisively. People began pressing their money on him for investment abroad. And the first few years, even sold some of it back. She shrugged her shoulders. Well, you can guess the rest. Rebecca nodded. But that was only the start, said Beth. He bought up land bit by bit, right here next to the meadow, and then almost everything all the way to the village. It all belonged to him back then. He paid well, and people really didn't have any choice because they had no money left. No one asked what he was going to do with the land, not at first anyway. And then it was too late. Too late for what? There was to be a slaughterhouse here, the biggest abattoir in Ireland. When I set off for Africa, they were frantically discussing ways to stop it. Citizens' action groups, petitions. And when I came back, nothing. White Park was empty, and I never heard that he was murdered until today. What's so bad about a slaughterhouse? Asked Rebecca. Beth smiled sadly. Did you ever see one? The stink, the animal transports. It would have ruined all of them. The tourist trade would have been done for, all the bed and breakfast places, the mad boar. But the farmers wouldn't have had a market for their meat either. That's how people are around here, you see. Complain as they might about McCarthy barging his way in, they'd have gone to buy meat where it was cheapest. So that was it, said Rebecca. I don't think I wanted to hear the details, not now. She looked up at Beth's black scarecrow figure. I came here because I wanted to know everything about him, particularly why he was murdered only just before. Sorry. I came here because I wanted to know everything about him, particularly why he was murdered only just before. She broke off and rubbed the bridge of her nose with her forefinger. It was a gesture the sheep knew well from George. He wrote me a letter, she added, and I took my time answering it. Let him stew, I thought. She swallowed. I'm sure we'd have been reconciled. I think so too, said Beth. Really? Asked Rebecca. Really, said Beth. And now I know a little about the life he lived outside that village. This is the first time I've admired him. As if they had heard a sound, they both turned their heads to the beautiful sunset sky above the sea. For safety's sake, the sheep looked the same way, but they couldn't see anything special. What will you do now? Asked Beth after a while. Rebecca shrugged. Count sheep? What about you? Pray, said Beth. I'll pray for you here and now. But then she didn't do anything after all, just stood with her eyes closed, casting a long, straight shadow in the evening twilight. Crickets chirped. A white cat stalked along the stone wall by the gate with its tail in the air. The first night birds began to sing while the sheep grazed the soft evening grass. Melmoth went on humming until a magpie flew down from the crow's tree and perched on his back. It didn't stay there long, but flew on again, up to the roof of the shepherd's caravan. It had something in its beak that shone like fire in the sunset light. This something dropped from the magpie's beak and landed, clinking, on the top step of the caravan. Rebecca quickly rose to her feet. The door of the shepherd's caravan creaked, and Beth opened her eyes. Rebecca was laughing, almost in high spirits. Wow, she said. If only I'd known it works as well as that. You must bring me a few of your tracks sometime. Beth clutched the glittering little pendant on her breast. Her knuckles were white. Come in, said Rebecca, from inside the shepherd's caravan. But Beth moved away from the door, shaking her head vigorously. The sheep were nervous too. Was something going to get out now? But nothing came out of the shepherd's caravan, any more than it had come out of the will. I ought to go back, said Beth. If I may offer you a piece of advice, don't put a light on this evening. I'll say you've gone away. She turned abruptly and marched back to the village, thin and upright, as she had done so many times before. Rebecca and her case disappeared into the shepherd's caravan. The sheep heard her turn the key in the lock. They put their heads together. Do you think she's gone to sleep? Asked Cordelia. She smelled tired, said Maud. She can't go to sleep, said Heather, a little stubbornly. It says so in the will. She has to read aloud to us. She's a bad shepherdess. Read aloud, bleated the sheep. Then they fell silent. Melmoth had come up to them, shaggy and mysterious as ever. Nonsense, he said. Don't you understand? The story is here. The story is us. The child needs the key. But she already has the key, said Heather. Melmoth shook his head. George's red lamb needs all the keys, he insisted. You mean the key for the box under the dolmen? Asked Cloud. Yes, under the dolmen, Melmoth agreed. Who has the key? I do, said Zora proudly. Ah, the sheep of the abyss. There was a note of respect in Melmoth's voice. Who else? No one answered. Melmoth nodded. Carried away into the air with mischievous pleasure, brilliantly hidden until the human cat came. We must hurry. You want me to give it up? Zora looked indignantly at Melmoth. To the shepherdess, as you did to George the shepherd. I never gave it to George just like that, said Zora. He used to wait for it on the edge of the abyss. George knew. Rebecca is a lamb. She doesn't know anything. We have to guide her to the milk, said Melmoth. Zora made a sulky face. A little later, Rebecca came out of the caravan. A lamb was crying outside, and the sound went to her heart. When she put her foot on the steps of the caravan, she saw something glittering there. It was not like fire, the sun was too low for that now, but more like spilled blood. She bent down, a key on a string. Shrugging, she put it in the pocket of her skirt. Today was not a day to wonder about anything. The lamb was still crying, and she followed the sound under the dolmen. The sheep watched expectantly as Rebecca came upon the hidden box. Othello had scraped the earth up first to make it easier for her to find. Rebecca laughed and took the key out of her pocket to open it. As she knelt to remove a small packet from the box, a good smell rose from the nape of her neck. She bit through a piece of string with her teeth. There was a crackle of plastic. Something dry crumbled in her fingers. She sniffed it. The sheep sniffed it too. It smelled strange, appetizing. Mabel knew at once that you could eat it. Grass, said Rebecca out loud. Any amount of grass. The sheep looked at each other. So that was the mysterious grass the humans were so keen on. Each of the sheep had carried a small packet like that, tied under their bellies and buried deep in their fleece, when George drove them to the other pasture for a few weeks. We're off over there again, George had announced every time. Operation Polyphemus. If only they'd known then that those little packets, tied with string and smelling of nothing, contained grass. Now it was up to Rebecca. Would she give them any of it? Apparently not. Rebecca held her skirt out like a kind of red bag and shoveled everything she could find under the dolmen into it. Many, many small packets came to light, and a larger squarish package, and a file of papers. Rebecca carefully carried it all back to the shepherd's caravan in her heavily laden, bunched-up skirt. She remained out of sight for a while. Then she was suddenly out on the steps again, with a glowing point of light in front of her lips. Sweet, heavy smoke wafted over the meadow. It made the sheep sleepy, but suddenly Rebecca was very talkative. So, I'm supposed to read aloud to ya, sheep, she said. I'll read aloud to ya, as no one ever read to ya before. And I know what I'll read too. Let's see if you like it. her footsteps unsteady now. She climbed back into the caravan and came out again with a book in her hand. She opened it somewhere in the middle. The sheep knew the book had to be opened at the front first, and only as it was read aloud did the sheets of paper slowly move from one side of the cover to the other. Some of the sheep bleated in protest, but most of them were too tired to get upset about this small deviation from the rules. They were being read aloud to again at last, anyway. Their young shepherdess couldn't be expected to get everything right straight off. Rebecca began to read. Catherine Earnshaw, may ye not rest as long as I am living. Ye said I killed ye. Haunt me then. The murdered do haunt their murderers, I believe. I know that ghosts have wandered the earth, but with me always, take any form, drive me mad. Only do not leave me in this abyss where I cannot find you. Oh God, it is unutterable. I cannot live without my life. I cannot live without my soul. The moon disappeared behind a dark cloud, and the only light falling on the pages now came from the little glowing point between Rebecca's lips. The sheep stood around the caravan, fascinated. In the light of that glow, she looked as the sheep had always imagined the Siamese pirate would look in Pamela and the Yellow Buccaneer. Narrow-eyed and melancholy, she closed the book. That's too sad, said Rebecca. I don't need a book to tell you sad stories, sheep. She was silent for a while, blowing sweet smoke over the meadow. Then she began again in her reading a loud voice, but without a book. Once upon a time, there was a little girl who had not one daddy, but two, a secret one and an unsecret one. She wasn't supposed to see the secret one, but of course they did see each other all the time, and they were very fond of one another. The little girl's mother, the beautiful queen, didn't like that, but there was nothing she could do about it. No one could do anything about it. But one day, the girl and her secret daddy quarreled about a stupid thing, and the girl did all she could to make him angry, even when it hurt her too. After that, they didn't speak to each other for a long time, not a single word. At last, a letter came for the girl. It said that her daddy was planning to travel to Europe, but first he wanted to see her. The girl hid her joy and kept him waiting, so he waited himself to death. It wasn't a bad story, but nothing like as good as what Rebecca had read them first. However, the sheep didn't mind. They suddenly felt so tired that they could hardly listen anymore, all but one of them. Mopple the whale had no time to feel tired. Ever since Rebecca had found the grass under the doorway, he had been obsessed by the idea of tasting it. This was his moment. Rebecca was sitting in the dark with her eyes half closed, humming quietly to herself. Beside her, forgotten now, lay an open packet of the grass. Quick as a flash, Mopple was beside her with his nose stuck inside the packet. Quick as a flash, he had swallowed the contents. By the time Rebecca noticed, Mopple was licking the last crumbs off the steps of the caravan. Rebecca began to laugh. Pothead, she said. Mopple chewed guiltily. He was disappointed by the grass. It smelled much better than it tasted. It didn't taste anywhere near as good as the grass in the meadow, or even as good as the hay. Human beings had a very poor sense of taste. Mopple lowered his nose and once more resolved never to eat anything unfamiliar again. The little glowworm in front of Rebecca's face went out. Time to sleep, she told the sheep, curtsying to them before disappearing inside the shepherd's caravan. This time they didn't hear the key turning in the lock. A clear night wind carried the smoke away, and the sheep felt less sleepy again. She's polite, said Cloud approvingly. The sheep nodded, all except Mopple, who had fallen asleep on his feet in the middle of the meadow. The others didn't want to sleep yet. All today's excitement had left them short of time to graze. They decided to stay outside a little longer, fulfilling their daily quota of grazing, work, and, and keeping Mopple company, since he was sleeping like a dormouse and wouldn't be woken. Night had fallen, the stars were twinkling, and somewhere an owl was hooting for all it was worth. Somewhere a lonely toad was croaking. Somewhere two cats were playing the game of love. And somewhere the purring sound of a powerful car engine was coming closer. Lane raised her head. The car stopped at the gate to the path through the fields. No lights. A man got out and steadily crossed the meadow to the shepherd's caravan. Just outside it, he stopped and sniffed the air. Then he climbed the steps and knocked on the door. Once, twice, then once again.